Hello, welcome to another session of the Houdini training. My name is Gianvito Serra, and today we're going to follow up on the Introduction to Groups class and go a little bit into some extended things that we can do with the groups. All these things are going to pretty much cover the group sub, but you're going to see just a few other operators which you can use for doing grouping type operations, okay? For these operations, we're also using the infinity scan head, which is everywhere. And we'll see how some of these operations apply to this, okay? So the first thing that we do is that we use a file operator to load the infinity scan head, which I happen to have on my local drive. Okay, this is just loading an OBJ file, nothing too strange about it. But it's important to note that this is a very typical thing to do in Houdini, to be working with external data as well. Okay, so first thing we're going to show is how to use the group sub to just group things based on the number. Okay, so we saw on the last class how we can use the group sub to simply select all of the actual faces. Okay, it was actually set to this, and you were selecting all the faces. Okay. I want to show here is just a few more methods to doing so. Okay, so we're going to look at the range method. Okay, so the range method by default will do, if we set these to defaults, is set up to actually go from beginning to end. And let me switch this to smooth shader so we can see a little bit better what is going on here. It's set to basically go from beginning to end on our poly count and select every other face. Okay, so what we're actually doing here is that we're going through my mesh and selecting every other face. Okay, if we change this to select every one out of one face, it will select every face. Okay, most of the control for that is actually done here. The variable $n here is basically symbolizes the ID of the last face. Okay, but we can simply start changing this number here to select, for example, say 1 out of every 3 faces, okay? Or even say 1 out of every 10 face, okay? So it's a good way to actually get a good range of faces with an actual by using these things. If we select every face, but then we change this to something like, say 1 to 100, we can select faces 1 to 100. See that? Okay. Likewise, this one right here is set up to actually select points, okay, and create a group called my test group. Now keep in mind, every time that you create a group, you can always look at your groups by middle mousing, and I'll remind you this, and actually going in here and seeing all your groups. This is the one that we just created. The thing to remember is that sometimes a mesh coming in may actually have groups already in it, okay, which is what we're actually seeing here. Okay, this particular head, probably because it was created maybe in ZBrush or maybe because it was created in a different application, already has all selection sets which are coming into Houdini as groups. Okay, but for now we're going to focus on the ones that we care, which is the one on the top here, which is our point group. Okay, we have 401 points in this test group. Okay, and my pattern for selecting is faces 1 to 300 and then faces 500 to 600. Okay, or points actually. And if we're looking here, what you can see is happening is that the first points that were created into this particular head were the points from the actual low-res patches that generated this head. Okay, so that's most likely why the order of the points is coming like that. But we can also at any point change this pattern to anything we want. So we can say just select 1 to 1000, and that selects faces 1 to 1000. You can always at any point middle mouse on any string in Houdini and use your slider to actually change the value that way as well. So we can see we can decrease or decrease our selection by actually doing so. Okay, this is not expanding a selection. This is simply extending this is simply changing the number of what we're actually selecting. Okay, we can also do this. We can see this. Okay, now although it's very cool that we can actually select by numbers, sometimes we don't want to do so. Sometimes we want to be able to select based on some kind of rule or some kind of like deterministic method, like we did on the last tutorial using the angles of the normals or the angles of the actual edges. Okay, so here is another example of what we can do. In here we have an actual paint operator. Okay, the paint operator allows me to paint colors on the actual geometry. Okay, let me go ahead and make my brush just a little smaller so that we can see this a little bit more clear. So I'm going to do this. So this is just painting black on top of white. Okay, what we're doing here in this group operator, whoops, is that we are basically selecting every point which is within some of that color threshold. Okay, so as I keep painting, you will notice that points keep getting added into my group. Okay, if we look at how the group is set up for doing so, is that it's set to actually operate by expression. So instead of doing pattern or by range, which is what we just saw, we're grouping using an expression. Okay, similar to how we learned expressions before, we can use expressions to also create groups. Okay, and I'm going to make this a little bigger so that we can see. So this expression is using a point expression, okay, which is looking at the paint node, okay, and is looking at the point number of that is actually being processed. It's looking for the color, okay, and it's looking at the red channel. It doesn't matter because it's black and white. And it's saying if the color is less, if the red color is less than 0.5, then select it. Otherwise, don't select it. Okay? If I change this number to less than 1, you will notice that it becomes a lot pickier about what actually gets selected. Okay? If I say, you know what, it has to be absolutely pretty much near black, like it has to be completely black, then I say equals to 0, then only points that are truly and 100% black will get added to this particular group. Okay? If I say only select all the points that have 1, which is basically all the white ones, then it will select only the points that are white. Okay? If I actually hide the lighting, you may be able to see this a little bit better as when we're actually doing the brushing. The shading can sometimes be a little distracting. Okay? So let's set this again to bigger than 0.5. Okay? Or actually less than 0.5. And you can see, you know, any operations that we do on the paint, such as, for example, smoothing, will affect the way how your grouping works. See that? Very cool. All right, moving on to some other examples. So here is our head again. And this time what we're going to do, we're going to be looking at the bounding tab. Okay? So all of these operations that we were looking at were happening in the number tab. We're now going to be looking in the bounding tab, which is another of the main ways for the group sub to actually create groups. Okay? So we highlight the first group that we have here. You will notice that we are grouping objects that are within these little bounding bots, which is one of the things that bounding can do. Okay, so now one thing to remember is that by default this thing will probably be set on like this. I'm going to actually switch this to default so we can see it a little bit better. By default this may be set like this, and we want to make sure that this is obviously off. Okay, so then when we go into bounding, we turn on, we only have enabled the bounding section, and then we're only looking at the bounding bots. Okay, you can always mix and match how you want these tabs to work, but for this I want to just show one at a time. Okay, so once some bounding bots is created via the group sub, we can go ahead and actually move it around, and you will see that the group changes as the bounding bot changes. Okay, so we can do this, and you make the bots bigger, and that will select or deselect more faces. Okay, you can obviously come in here and change the numbers here as well, and that will also modify your selection. Okay, so this is probably one of the more valuable ways to actually create these groups, right? Because it's based on where things are located in space, you know, which in a lot of cases you will most likely want to operate on things based on where they are in space. Okay? If we look at this example on group 6, it's a lot like the one that we have on group 5, but this one is actually working on an actual bounding sphere. Okay? So wherever the sphere goes, the group gets created. Okay? Very cool. Now, the one that we have here is going to be very interesting. Okay, so we have here our head. And over here we have an extruded letter. Okay, the letter H coming from a font sub. Okay? And what this group operator is doing now is doing similar to what we're doing with the bounding sphere and what we did with the bounding bots. But instead of doing bounding bots and bounding sphere, we're using bounding objects. Okay? And what bounding object does, it takes the second input, which in this case is the bounding object, into the group sub, and uses that, the volume of that, as the area that you use to select your polygons. Okay? So if we click on the font operation, and we can even, as we modify this, it will actually affect the grouping as well. Okay? Even so that if I actually change the letter to something like A, for example, you will notice that now the group is updated to match the letter A. And this is, of course, you know, fully deterministic. We can put, for example, $F, which is the actual frame number. And now the frame number is what actually drives what is actually selected on the actual faces. Okay? Very cool. So just to recap that, we can switch those methods by switching in between here to bounding bots, switching here to bounding sphere, and you can see the controls right here, and switching to bounding objects. Okay. We can also do bounding volume, but we won't cover volumes for a few other lessons, you know, in which case that we will probably look into this right now. But bounding objects is very similar to how that works. Okay. Now, when we create a group, say for example I wanted the group not to be points, but to be primitives, we can also use the group operator to convert groups from one class to another, okay? I'll show you how we do that. So if we look at the groups up on the very top, there is 3 tabs. There is the create, the combine, and the edit, okay? The create tab allows us to create groups, and we saw how to do by numbers, by bounding. In the last tutorial, you saw how to use normal and edges as well, okay, which we'll review a little bit. The combine tab we also saw in the last tutorial, which allows us to, for example, invert a group, grab all the faces of one group, and then get every face that is not in that group and put it into a new group, okay? The edit is where you can actually change groups that exist. So, for example, we can rename them, or we can convert them from one class to another. So in this case, it used to be a point group, like we had here, and I'm grabbing the point group and I'm converting it to a primitive group, okay? So you can see here, I can go from points to primitives. I can even switch to edge groups if I want to as well. In this case, I want it to be as primitives, okay? There is a few options that you can do here. You can, for example, rename it, like actually call it something else. So like you could say my test group prims, and you will actually end up with a primitive and a point group at the same time. Okay? If you do want to make sure to turn on preserve original, and that will keep both. Okay? In the case of going to, say, for example, an edge to points or an edge to prims, you can even use these to omit entities in the new groups which are not wholly contained in the old group. What that means that in some cases, if your group is only coming to a certain point, okay, this basically determines how you want to make that conversion, okay? So omitting entities makes it so that it will only add it to the group if all 4 points on the primitive are part of the group, okay? If it's not, then it won't add them. So if we go here, you will see that it actually matches the group more closely. If we turn that off, it spreads a little bit because all that it takes is for 1 point to be on the group for that primitive to be able to add it to the group, okay? And like we said before, once we add it to the group, we can actually use an operator to operate on it. Oh, it's not converted, since this thing is expecting the group to be called my test group. And lo and behold, now we are hiding faces based on the actual frame number, like we see here, okay? Can even make the font a little bit smaller so we can see that a little bit more clear. There we go. We go to 1. There's number 35 there. And as we actually play with the actual frame, you will see the visibility change to reflect the frame number that we're on. Alright, very cool. Moving over on this side, here is our scan coming in again, and in this group we're actually using the normal tab under the create section, okay? And the normal tab is what allows us to, and we saw this before, it allows us to actually give it pick a normal direction, like in this case I'm using points, alright? And what I'm basically selecting in this case is any normals that are within a spread angle of 78 degrees from this particular angle pointing up, okay? So as I play with my, and I'll hide the normals to see it's a little more clear. So as I increase my spread angle, you will see that the more the normal of the point faces up, the more the actual, more likely the point is to get selected, okay? It's a little bit like lighting, if you will, okay, to where like only the top points are actually getting added to the group, okay? And in this particular case, we're doing it based on the actual edges and using the minimum edge angle, which you saw on the actual other tutorial. We use this to actually pick up sharp edges. Let me switch these to edges, okay? So now this is basically picking any edges which are actually within 20 degrees, so very sharp, and then we can actually play with this value to increase the amount of edges that get added into the group, okay? You can also set a max edge angle to maybe pick edges within an edge angle, or even both if you want to pick a very specific range in between them, okay? We can also do it by edge length, okay? So say I want every edge which is, this is a little bit small, so we're going to use smaller numbers. I'm going to grab an edge which is within, within this particular range right here. So we'll go to this, and then we'll actually go to this. And you can see that it's selecting edges based on their length, basically, okay? You can even, and unfortunately we won't be able to demonstrate this here, but we can even select edges which are border edges, which is what this little clip does, but this mesh is actually watertight, so we can see it here. Once we create a group, we can actually transfer groups, okay? And we can say that we want to transfer my test group. I'll turn off primitive since we actually made this group into an edge group. And all that is doing is transferring groups in between these two meshes based on 3D space. Okay, so now I end up with basically this side having that edge group, even though I created it from this side. Okay. There is also a group copy which will copy groups based on IDs. Okay. We can also come in here, and although we did this with the paint operator, there is also a group paint operator which allows us to just paint groups without having to do any kind of expressions or anything. Okay. And then once we create them, we can do whatever we want with those faces. So for example, we could, we're actually doing it with points here, so we could probably, for example, do a peak operation on the points based on that group. Let's go ahead and actually increase our points. There we go. So then as we actually come here to paint, you can see that we're able to actually choose what actually gets pushed out. Okay. One more that I'm going to show, and I'll just go ahead and show it here. So let's go back to our scan. Like I was saying, sometimes when you import a scan from an external program, you may get all these groups which you may or you may not want in there. Okay, so you may want to clean this. Okay. You can also do this with a group operator. In addition to create groups, we can also delete groups, okay? So if we turn off group name so that it doesn't try to create any groups, and we go to the edit tab, we can go to delete, and just say to delete every group. We can use wildcards, so if we use, if we look at the groups here, you will notice that the groups are all start with group. So we can just say, okay, delete everything, every group that is just called group. And if we middle masking here, now you will notice that all of those extraneous groups are gone. Okay? You can even, if you want, just pick and choose one group where all the groups are coming in. So for example, I want to do delete group 12, group 14, and group 19. Then we middle mouse, now you will notice that those groups are gone. Whereas if we middle mouse here, you will notice that they are still here. Okay, well that's a nice little brief look at some of the things that we can do with groups. You can obviously do a lot more than this, but this will be probably a good place to actually get started. Thank you for watching. My name is Gianvito Serra, and we'll see you on the next session.